All right, Linda Davis, welcome to Power Presence Position.
Thank you, Eleanor. I'm so happy to be here.
Katrine Marcal, welcome to Power Presence Position.
Thank you.
I am so looking forward to this conversation, ridiculously looking forward to this conversation about economics and inflation and all the topics that I wish we spoke about more as women leaders and entrepreneurs. But before we get there, I really wanted to take a moment to explore the connection that each of you have to economics, to global markets. Like, what makes you wake up and decide, I want to build a career talking and writing and educating about these things? So I guess I'll start with you, Katrine. What prompted your passion for economics? And I know it sounds like an oxymoron to some people that you can actually have a passion for economics, but you can.
Oh, yes, you can. Well, I guess I've always been interested in economics, but my interest certainly got stronger from the resistance I met when it came, especially to sort of being a woman interested in this topic. I mean, even I went to university studying economics in Sweden, and even in Sweden, one of the world's most gender equal countries, we had, an economics professor standing in front of 200 students saying that male students just don't understand economic concepts. Male students understand economic concepts so much faster than female students. And this was in Sweden. And I just sat there and felt, wow, I need to get out of here, but I was still really passionate about this topic. So I became a journalist, and a few years later, I found myself in the old town of Stockholm in December with lots of snow falling outside, about to interview the winners of the Nobel Prize in Economics that year. And one of them comes in, he takes one look at me and he says, "So who wrote your questions?"
Oh, you after this interview, you need to tell us who that was.
I will tell you who that was. And obviously I didn't have a good answer, because you never have in these situations. But I think all of that resistance, it just, made me feel even stronger about the topic. And, I've made a career about talking about economics and writing about it, and particularly the perspective of women and economics.
Well, it's so interesting because you and I have talked about this before, the way in which it's very acceptable and normal for us as women to talk about and celebrate the work of Brené Brown, to talk about the power of vulnerability and that kind of thing. And that's what society seems to expect that we're going to talk about. It's so much rarer to have women coming together, or maybe it's not rare, but it's rare to be featured women coming together talking about economics. Linda, I'm curious about you. So listeners, there's a relation here. So Linda and I are related. She is my aunt, but it's kind of more like cousin, in fairness, more like cousin. It's one of those kinds of relationships. And so we come from a family of economists, and we sort of share that. But I'd love to hear, what was it for you, Linda, that got you interested in pursuing the sort of writing and educating about money and markets and larger economic forces as a career?
Well, I have to thank my father, your grandfather, for that, because he was very clever, and he set up a bank account for me when I was about 7. And this was in the 1970s, when inflation peaked at about 25% and interest rates about 18%. And I saved my money. I loved saving, and I saved birthday and Christmas gifts. And I couldn't believe it. I would get my monthly bank statements, and my money just grew and grew, and without me doing anything, grew and grew and grew. And so I got an early taste for compound interest, and it did make me fascinated by money. And then as I got older, I discovered this whole money world, this whole world of economics. And I thought, you know what, I'd quite like to go into that. And then I discovered that actually women didn't really. And like you, Katrine, that made me more determined to go into it. And I got into Oxford to read politics, philosophy, and economics. And that gave me a certain amount of armory, and made me partially bulletproof. But not that you want to go around brandishing that, but that helped me when I got into the city. It helped it was my credentials, I suppose, but I still obviously met quite a bit of resistance. But I found that world sufficiently fascinating to carry on in it for long enough to make my running away money and then run away and then write. And I wrote novels about money. And it was only when I was doing the 20th anniversary edition of Nest of Vipers, which was luckily, wonderfully, a bestseller around the world, that I realized I really liked writing nonfiction about money. I was looking at the major developments in the world economies over the past 20 years and the financial world. And I discovered I really liked it and that I had a lot to say, more than I could say in the introduction to a book. And that started my book, 10 Things Everyone Needs to Know About Money. And I'm sort of on a campaign, and I'll talk about it more later on, because I discovered a huge disparity in how women are spoken to in the financial sphere and about money. And I'll come back to that. But there's so much to say about it. So I am kind of impassioned by the whole subject.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting, of course, you mentioned the city. And for our transatlantic listeners, the city is basically the United Kingdom's version of Wall Street. So what Wall Street is to the United States, the city is to London and
but
to
with
the United Kingdom.
Yes, but with medieval sort of housing. And,
that's right, with medieval
very
housing.
narrow streets and
exactly. And I'm going to be honest, better accents.
Well, I'm not sure. It's a arguably.
Yeah. So I want to jump on what you just said, that you started to see discrepancies in how women are in conversations related to women and money. And Katrine, you talked about your own experience of really sort of being written off, as a financial journalist, as an economic journalist. Where do you think this comes from? I guess a better question is, do you think women are underserved when it comes to education, media articles, content about larger economic issues? I'll start with you, Katrine. What are your thoughts on that?
I have a lot of thoughts about this because, yes, I really do think this is the case. And I think lately there has been a lot, of exciting things around sort of investment advice tailored to women. But where, I really see, the big gap is, for example, in the whole business book genre. And I mean, this has actually pissed me off for years, how, why can't business books for women not be about the big economic themes shaping our world? I mean, they never are. It's like there's this rule that business books for women always have to be about how to achieve work-life balance or boss up or unleash your inner whatever. And I'm all in favor of, people unleashing whatever inner thing that they need to release, but it's the pattern. It's how we let male voices speak about these big forces that are shaping our economies and our world, and women are sort of pushed to the side and left to share their personal journeys or give practical advice. And I think this is such a shame.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's almost as though we're not allowed to have an intellect about these things.
Yeah, and I think so. And I also think I remember Mary Beard, she's this British professor of history, talking about how in Greece during antiquity, sort of men were, obviously standing on the square, sort of talking about politics and the big things. And the only two sort of things that women were allowed to speak about in public was if they either spoke on behalf of somebody else or if they testified as victims. And I think that's still something there, right? That it's sort of okay for a woman to talk about how, the tough things she's been through or to speak on behalf of other people, but to sort of proudly stand there and say, this is what's going to happen with interest rates, or this is what I think about the new sort of 5-year plan in China. That's still, not as accepted.
Yeah, and not encouraged. Linda, what are your thoughts on that? Do you echo what Katrine has said? What's your sense about whether we as women are underserved in terms of contributing to and taking part in broader discussions about economics?
Well, absolutely. I agree with that. And if I can look at one perspective, it is how women are spoken to about money. Because if we are going to take our place in writing about money, writing about the economy, we need to be happy in that zone. Now, quite a few of us are, but quite a few of us aren't. And this goes right down to our daughters and how we bring them up. And I discovered all sorts of gender disparities in how we talk to our daughters about money. Money itself is the most taboo subject ahead of politics, sex, and religion. People don't like talking about money. And if that's how you grow up, the money world feels alien. So let's take another angle to that. So looking at how we manage our own money. If you feel it's alien, and then if the money world speaks to you as if you are an outsider and you don't really belong, and you feel patronized, you're going to think it's not for you. So for instance, and it's not quite as bad now, but a number of years ago, if you looked at any ads for women by investment advisors, banks, private money managers, or just the general banks, you would see images of men in speedboats at the helm, powering ahead to their financial future, or stepping off a private jet. Women, the ads about women were either described as splurgers on handbags, and not even investment handbags, by which I mean ones which you can resell for a high value. We were either splurgers or coupon cutters. Economizing, storing our little pennies in a jam jar. So the way we speak to women about money is very unequal. And there's a fintech pioneer who started Starling Bank called Anne Boden, who started a campaign a few years ago called Make Money Equal. And that was a fantastic initiative. And we're by no means there, but it recognizes this problem. And women are not going to feel comfortable taking their place in the money sphere, in the world of economics, unless it becomes a more familiar zone to us. And so it's incredibly important how we talk to our daughters. It's incredibly important how the money world talks to us. And this book and the next one, which I'm going to write, which will be specifically directed towards women, it does address that.
It's interesting. Do you see a difference in terms of how we talk about money and how we talk about economics? So this is interesting because I think there may have been a shift, when, and I can't remember when this became, I can recall this conversation starting maybe 10 years ago, if not a little before then, when there seemed to be this dawning awareness that women actually control a huge amount of purchasing power, and that we influence a lot of household purchasing decisions. And so a lot of advertising, I walked into my bank, for instance, to get some cash out of the cash point. And I can remember seeing this pair of stilettos, which I would never wear. And it was like, you're worth it. Get this credit card because you're worth it. I was like, oh, wow. I think we're worth a little more than those.
Yeah.
But my point is, as this awareness of women and our purchasing power has increased, you have seen this increasing sort of conversation around financial advisors that speak to women. When a woman's husband dies, she's very likely to leave her financial advisor to go and speak to, to find a new one that suits her. How has that translated into broader conversations about economics, about economic policy? Is there a connection there? What are your thoughts on that, Katrine?
I don't think there's enough of a connection. I think, what you're describing is, a lot of sort of, women in the role of consumer in the economy. And that's fine. And it's true. Women, influence 80% of sort of all consumer decisions in the global economy. That's like a figure you often hear. And that's something that makes businesses sort of pay attention. But historically, also, the role of consumer is probably the only economic role that women have been encouraged to take, right? You know, there was part of, sort of the role of women. So the man was out making money and women were sort of running the household, and they were purchasing things. And that, I mean, women had consumer power before we had the vote, right? So it's in some form, it's like, it's an older and more accepted economic role, I think, to look at women as that, as consumers. And it's harder to, I think, for us to accept women as, say, economic policymakers. But there is a lot changing. I mean, we have Janet Yellen serving as the first female Treasury Secretary in the US, you know, Ngozi Nkambi-Weah at WTO, World Trade Organization, Christine Lagarde at the European Central Bank. So there are
World's
things
coolest
happening.
woman. World's coolest woman.
She's cool.
Christine Lagarde. Listen, she's cool.
She's cool, but do you remember when she was appointed? I mean, all of, you know, everyone was like, oh, she's not qualified, blah, blah,
She's
blah,
a
blah.
synchronized swimmer, the ex-synchronized swimmer. I remember seeing her, you know, described as so rude. I'm like, you know what? Why don't you guys maybe speak a little bit more about Dominique Strauss-Kahn and a little less about Christine Lagarde?
Couldn't agree more.
What are your thoughts on that, Linda? You know, because I think this concept of woman as consumer versus woman as agent of wealth, woman as economic powerhouse, it's fascinating to me. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, so women as consumer, yes, that's how we have exercised more power. But what I want to look at is woman as investor. And it's it's not just managing the household economy, if you like, but the household spending, but managing the household wealth, or managing your own personal wealth, or managing your corporate wealth. Now, this is where I find it gets really interesting, because there's still a big disparity in the numbers, the percentages of women that invest in the stock market versus men. I mean, I'll give you a little stat. So as of October 2019, 21% of men in the UK have stocks and shares ISAs, compared to only 13% of women. And there are a lot of reasons behind that. And typically risk aversion is brought up as one of them. And you had to ask yourself why that is. But I think that risk aversion comes because women don't feel, or haven't had the same level of confidence about investing in the markets, for all the reasons I've said before. They feel the moneyverse is not open to them. So this is the area that really interests me, is how to get more women to invest in the stock market and other investment opportunities as well, so that they can manage their own personal wealth better. I mean, so there's the sort of macro picture, if you like, of women in the economy, women taking on those politico-economic positions, but then there's also women as individuals, as entrepreneurs, managing their money. And there's a lot of ground that we need to make up there.
Well, and it's interesting because I've noticed in conversations with women entrepreneurs that whenever we start to talk about money, and especially using money as a tool, when we talk about using other people's money to grow your business, as an example, or, building wealth, building cash reserves, setting up trusts, things like that, where you're using money as a tool versus something to be generated and stored away. You can see there's a thirst, a passion, and interest around it. And I think it's because, we have advanced so much. But I think, to your point, Linda, the way that we talk about money is still kind of a little 1960s, like a little 1960s. Let's store it away. Let's not be too, let's be extremely conservative. You don't want to go and blow your money on, this kind of thing, versus men who I see there's a much more natural conversation that seems to be had right now, or more comfortable or prominent conversation about using money as a tool. Now, speaking of money, so we recently moved. We were looking at doing a large scale sort of renovation. And then we realized, okay, so after 2020, 2020 interrupts supply chains. Governments are pumping money into the economy, and the cost of construction supplies had gone up by 150%. It was massive. It was
Oh.
massive. So wood, like wood that you would use to build stuff, like construct a new house, has gone up massively. So I started thinking about inflation. And I started thinking about inflation because of the amount of money that governments have pumped into the economy, certain savings that businesses have had. So there's a lot of cash in the economy. There's a lot of demand in the economy, and that leads to inflation. So I wanted to talk about this because I think it's, again, something when I start talking about it, it can have, it's not good or bad. It can totally have an impact on women entrepreneurs in particular, but this is a conversation nobody is having. So I want to ask you about your thoughts on it. But before that, I want to define inflation. So inflation is the decline of purchasing power of your money over time. So a great example of this is, you in 1970, it cost 25 cents to buy a cup of coffee, according to Investopedia. By 2019, that was $1.60. Clearly, they don't buy lattes. But that's the loss of purchasing power, right? That's the loss of purchasing power of money. So when your money loses value, prices increase and your money doesn't buy as much. That's inflation, right? So I wanted to open up a discussion about this. The RBC, Royal Bank of Canada, one of our big banks in the country, the CEO says that because of inflation, central banks are going to be raising interest rates by next year. I read another headline, the UK inflation unexpectedly accelerated in January. We're seeing inflation in the United States. So I wanted to check in, and I think we'll start with you, Katrine. Inflation, is this something, can you sort of walk us through a little bit for women entrepreneurs? Are you concerned about it? Is it good? Is it bad? Can you give us a little primer that will help people really understand what inflation is as it relates to our businesses?
Okay, yeah, I'll certainly try. So inflation, as you said, is not in itself a bad thing, and the opposite would be worse, probably prices going down. In a healthy growing economy, you want prices to go up over time. You just don't want them to go up too much, and and so on. And that's what sort of central banks, the Fed in the US are thinking about how to manage. I am personally not that worried about inflation right now. And I think because you actually did a podcast episode, I think it was in December, on something that I think can help people maybe understand some of this. It was called the coming pent up cash extravaganza. Do you remember?
Yeah. Yes, I do.
And you were arguing that business owners need to think about that people have held back spending during the pandemic. Savings have gone up, and when the virus is gone, people will go out and spend the money, and female entrepreneurs need to be ready. And this sort of, pent up cash extravaganza is actually also the reason it's not the correct economic term for why sort of people think that inflation will be going up. It is, we've not been able to spend money on things like holidays or going to restaurants, and the economy will open up, and suddenly people will have all this money trying to sort of book holidays, and there's only so many holiday cottages to rent in Wales, or so many restaurants to go to. So, hotel rooms in Wales will become more expensive because there's too much money chasing too few hotel rooms, and you'll have inflation. This is what people worry about. However, and this is my thinking, Linda might not agree, is that, because this is a pent up spending extravaganza caused by a very specific situation, it might not be permanent. People will spend through this money. Yes, we'll have inflation, but things will go back to normal after a while. And the sort of supply chain problems that you're describing with the wood for your house, will hopefully correct themselves. And same with sort of car manufacturing will take off, and and we'll have inflation, but only for a limited period. That's what I think.
So not like when you, Linda, had your bank account and inflation was what, 20%? I hear it's hard to grasp.
Up to
like, the
24%.
reality. Right?
Yeah.
Unbelievable. So what are your thoughts? Are you concerned about inflation and about what's going on? I mean, I know in Canada, our deficit is absolutely massive. Like the spending, and we can talk about that in a moment. But from an inflation perspective, is this something that concerns you or that you think we need to be concerned about, Linda?
So I'm concerned about it for two reasons. One, there is this massive amount of money sloshing around the economy. I mean, there's the pent-up savings, and I think Katrine's point about that's not all necessarily going to go and fuel inflation long term. But there's the amount of government spending, there's the amount of quantitative easing, there's Biden's 1.9 trillion stimulus that's coming in. There is a decrease in capacity. The long-term bond yields, which are typically used by those who watch, the commentators who watch, and the financial markets, it's their oracle, if you like. They are rising. So certainly the markets think that inflation is coming. What level, we don't know, and it's incredibly difficult to predict. But if people begin to fear inflation, and if the markets fear it, that in itself will have negative consequences. In that, one of the things that gets the economy going, one of the things that gets individuals going, is confidence. And if we are fearful, we're going to make different decisions. So the specter of inflation, which is certainly looming, inflation, whether it comes or not, I'm not sure, and that's very difficult to tell. But the specter is definitely looming, and that will affect people's decision making. So I am concerned, and I suppose one of the things I wrote about extensively in my book, because it makes many points that we can apply now, is this hyperinflation that we're not going to see. But it's useful because it teaches us certain things. So, in Germany, in the Weimar Republic in the 1920s, notes became worth nothing more than as firewood. They were burnt. You couldn't spend them. There were stories of people's suitcases being suitcases full of money that people would take to pay employees. The suitcase would be stolen, the money would be left. It was worthless. So there are extreme scenarios that we can all learn from. But long answer, the specter is certainly out there, and it's potentially worrying. And there are things we need to do about it that maybe we can come on to later.
Yeah. You had something on that, Katrine.
No, I mean, so these stories of hyperinflation in Europe between the First World War and the Second World War, they're always brought up, and they're these sort of pictures of, women pulling big wheelbarrows full of money, and that, you needed a wheelbarrow of money in order to buy, I don't know, one piece of bread. And it's scary, but I think it's also worth remembering that that was a political choice. It was, it had to do with, without going too far into very complicated European history, it had to do with the big war debts that sort of Germany had after the First World War, and they tried to, inflate themselves out of them. So that was a political choice, and I don't think it's comparable to sort of normal situations, which, we're in a more sort of normal economy now.
I think the borrowing levels because of COVID, the funding of those was a political decision. The decision of governments to spend huge amounts, unprecedented amounts in modern times, on fighting COVID and supporting businesses, as you know, has raised debt levels massively. So it's not on the same scale, but there is a political decision that has had massive consequences in terms of debt and the amount of money circulating throughout the economy. So there's that factor in common.
Well,
I don't think hyperinflation is coming. Let me put that straight out there, but it's an interesting historical lesson.
But there is the thing that concerns me a little bit, which is that when you really start talking and really start digging into what world leaders are saying and what their finance ministers are saying, there doesn't really seem to be any plan, at least in Canada, where I'm much more, aware of the level of spending and the level of debt that the country has racked up in order to provide, in many cases, much needed support, to people. But there doesn't really seem to be a plan about how we're going to dig ourselves out of this hole. So I wanted to sort of make this really relevant to people who are listening. So when you start to have inflation, so the economy starts heating up, and like we said, look, it's not necessarily a bad thing. You want certain levels of inflation. It shows that the economy is growing. It's like inflation isn't bad. You do sort of want prices to increase over time. But now, after years of historically low interest rates, and of course, the interest rate is how much money you spend on how much money, how the cost of borrowing, basically. Yeah. Now, central banks are saying, okay, we're going to start raising interest rates. So maybe I'll give this to you, Linda. What's the relationship between inflation and interest rates? And women entrepreneurs, think about your mortgage, think about business loans, think about lines of credit that you may be using to fuel business growth. What's the relationship between interest rates and inflation?
So typically, interest rates and inflation are positively correlated. And so that if you get an increase in inflation, you get an increase in interest rates for a couple of reasons. One is that when inflation does start rising, the central banks and the governments do start getting a bit nervous, and they start thinking maybe we should increase interest rates to dampen it down. Because if you increase the cost of borrowing, fewer people are going to borrow. There won't be, it dampens demand, is the theory. And the other thing that happens is in the bond markets, and I know they sound terribly obscure, but they sound irrelevant, but let me give you a little. James Carville, who is one of Bill Clinton's advisors, said, if I were reincarnated, I used to think I'd want to come back as the president, the Pope, or a major baseball player. I would actually come back as the bond market, because the bond market is the bond market is incredibly powerful. And when governments need to borrow, they go into the bond markets. And if there is inflation, and if the bond markets think there'll be more inflation, they will basically give the government less. They won't give as much for the debt. So it costs more to raise money. So it's a combination of the government action and also the bond markets affecting the price of money. And obviously, so typically they're correlated. Interest rates, inflation goes up, interest rates goes up. The real thing to ask is what the real interest rate is, which is the nominal rate of interest minus the rate of inflation. And that varies, and as much the correlation is less strong, but it clearly hits borrowers, and in theory it benefits savers. But if you have big debts like the governments do, inflating your way out of it has always been what they have done, and that's another reason why inflation fires might get stoked.
So what does it mean? So if we're looking at, you have central bankers saying, look, inflation is happening, therefore we're going to start raising interest rates. We see certain costs going up. I know in my province, for instance, wages increased by 6% last year, which I thought was really interesting. Question then, Katrine, what does this mean for a woman entrepreneur, who's running her business? It can be so easy for us to say that doesn't really mean much. Other people are in charge of this. They're going to figure it out. It has not a lot to do with my business today. What does inflation mean for your average woman entrepreneur?
Yeah, and I think it's very damaging to have that view of the economy. Like, it's just like the weather. It's something that just happens, and it's outside my window. But you really should be thinking about sort of how is the weather going to be, and try to adapt to it, obviously. So I think this is certainly very relevant to female entrepreneurs to think about. So we don't know if they're going to start raising interest rates. They might sort of agree more with me earlier, thinking that, well, this is a temporary thing. If we start raising rates too quickly, then we are going to hurt, the recovery, and we might get ourselves into a recession. But yes, the normal thing is, like Linda says, for central banks and the Fed to start raising rates. And so then it becomes harder to get credit. And we know that women already have a harder time getting credit. And, if we get proper inflation, it will get worse. So that's number one to think about, your access to credit, because it will be more expensive, and there's also going to be less of it in that case. The other thing is that, women tend to run smaller businesses, and inflation tends to be easier for larger businesses to deal with. I mean, if you were building like 10,000 houses instead of just thinking about renovating your own house, and wood was going up, you could probably negotiate a better deal on that wood if you were buying huge quantities, right? So in a situation with inflation, the larger businesses will be able to still sort of get access to the things they need in order to, run their businesses at a better price, while smaller businesses, you just, building one house, you might be able to, you have to sort of pass that cost on to your customers, which is not good.
That's right. That's right. What are your thoughts on that, Linda? How do you think inflation could impact your average woman entrepreneur? What should we be thinking about? So we've talked about, look, number one, it can impact our access to capital, which women already notoriously struggle to get capital. I can't tell you the number of banks who will say of a knowledge-based or service-based business, oh, you have no assets. So totally archaic. And so there's that. And then the ability of a small business to manage, to be able to absorb, the shock. What else, how else do you think this could potentially impact women entrepreneurs? What else should we be thinking about?
Okay, so there's two things, and Katrina's covered one, which is the particulars that will affect the business. But if we look at our own financial position and our business's financial position, so what are our financial aims? What is our roadmap? When do we want to exit? When do we want to retire? And we have our portfolio, our business portfolio, the amount of cash in the business, our own personal investments. We've got that, we think, sorted out. And then inflation comes along. It's going to radically affect our plans, both as individuals and as entrepreneurs. So, cash, for instance, if you're sitting on cash personally or corporately, another example, if you have a 12% inflation rate, in 5 years, that halves your purchasing power. And 12% doesn't sound a lot, does it? But it has a dramatic effect. So we need to think about what we can do to make ourselves more robust to handle inflation better, both corporately and individually. And for me, that is investing in a portfolio of different assets. And I'll give you, so for instance, if we look at a 10-year, and so you would ask, or women entrepreneurs might ask, okay, what would you put your personal money in? And what would you, let's say there's a big cash balance and you have treasury operations in your business, where should we be putting our cash? So if we look at a 10-year period up to 2019, I have a list here of the classic investments. So designer handbags, for instance, over that period went up 108% in total. UK stock market, 141%. Fine art, 158. Coins, special rare coins, obviously 193. The S&P Standard & Poor's 500, 258%. Classic cars, 258%. And in the number one spot, casked rare whiskey, 582%. So ladies, casked whiskey is where you want to be. And let me tell you, that would work.
It's not just for drinking.
Yeah, it's not just for drinking. It is a liquid asset, however. You can sell it easily. So those are the things that I would be investing in. Not all of them necessarily. If you have a whole load of Hermes and handbags in your cupboard, don't use them, bag them up, sell them in 5 years' time. They'll do you very nicely. But women in handbags, that sort of drives me mad. But it's just a frivolous example of actually how you can invest and where you can invest. So I would put together a diversified portfolio. I wouldn't agonize over it on a year-by-year basis. I always take long-term views, 5 or 10 years, and one asset class is going to perform well one year, another one the next year. It ends up looking quite random. But if you are well diversified, you can weather these storms, and the things I've just listed tend to outperform inflation. So at least you know that your personal nest egg is going to be secure over the long term, assuming you pick good stock market investments, and that's another subject. But it's quite easy to have a tracker fund, for instance.
Well, what I'm really hearing here is that the best way to prepare for things like inflation, like rising interest rates, that kind of thing, is to actually elevate out of the operations of your business for a little bit, and to think about things like your cash position, to think about the wealth of your business, your personal wealth, and to be looking a little bit more broadly at that. That to me feels like the broader. So there's things like, inflation and interest rates could have an impact on your supply chain. They could have an impact on shipping. So for instance, we used to ship partial containers of like swag and stuff from China, and that cost has gone up enormously. So it's prohibitive right now. It's totally prohibitive. Along with tariffs, it's prohibitive to ship fun swag from China for us, and it's so there's one way in which it does impact operations. But what I'm really hearing from both of you is to sort of elevate out of operations a little bit and think more broadly about the impact of this on your wealth, on your money, on your cash position, and to get educated around that. We could talk about this all day, but I would like to, because for us, and for myself and Linda, Katrine, our goal here was to really open up a conversation about broader issues related to economics. We thought inflation would be a really good hook for this. But our goal is really to inspire you to think a little bit more broadly about the relationship between you, your money, your business, and broader economic trends that are shaping our environment. So I've got a couple of questions around this. Where do you guys go? So for me, I read The Economist fairly religiously. It's easy. It's an app on my phone. I read it, and it just sort of gets me into a different world of what's going on, like what's going on globally. I'd love to hear just a resource or a tip, and we'll sort of go external, because then I want everyone to know more about the resources that you guys actually have created. But Katrine, where do you go, or what's a suggestion of a resource that women who are listening could check out to start to plug in a broader way to some of these larger forces?
No, but I think, like you mentioned, reading The Economist, I mean, that's a nice British magazine, to start with, because they really have that sort of macro picture of everything. I mean, it's just, just going through reading the Financial Times, for example, here in the UK, or the Wall Street Journal in the US, and just, just familiarizing yourself with these things, because it's not difficult. It really isn't. There's a lot of, economics is largely this language, that, some people speak and others don't speak it. And like any language, you can just learn it. It's mainly a lot of terms, and economists love to make things sound really, like it's, rocket science or physics, and it's not. Most of these things, I mean, the economy is about people and relationships, and you just have to think about it like that. And, and women have so much to offer to this debate and discussion. So, I mean, my suggestion wouldn't just be to go and read and thinking, oh, I need to educate myself, but it's more thinking about yourself differently, thinking about you as a female business owner, as somebody who can contribute to this debate based on your experience. Because I've been to the Economist in London, and I bet that a lot of the listeners to this podcast have a lot more hands-on business experience than the guys that write the Economist.
Boom, there you go. How about you, Linda?
So I read I read esoterically, so from the basic newspapers, the Times, the Telegraph, the Guardian, they often have good, accessible pieces on finance, actually a lot more accessible than the specialist magazines. I read Money Week. There are a lot of publications. I could put together a reading list because as research, I mean, I'm just looking around in my office as we speak. I'm coming back, don't worry. I'm just picking up two of my things that I'm about to jump into. This one's not going to show very well unless I do that. It's Why Women Are Poorer Than Men and What We Can Do About It. Another one is The Economic Psychology of Everyday Life. But taking it away, Money Week is another good one. But the national papers, the other thing I would do is just start looking at investment platforms, whether it's Hargreaves Lansdown, which I use. It's not a plug, by the way. I just happen to use it, and start investing, even if it's a small amount. If it's £50 a month, ideally into an ISA, which will be tax efficient. Start doing it, and then you will learn, because you'll get the feedback, you'll watch the markets, you can apply it, you can see what your growing, sometimes falling portfolio will do. So it's kind of get in there. As Katrine says, these women entrepreneurs we're used to getting our hands dirty. So let's get our hands dirty. And I mean, money is always considered dirty. Let's get really dirty. and if we're not already doing so, step into that sort of wild sea of investments, and learn by doing.
This is so interesting. I think about so many of these conversations about money and economics a little bit like the same way that some women feel when they walk into a weight room. So I can remember back in the day walking into a weight room, and thank God I was with my mom, who was like a power lifter. So you'd walk in and it's just all guys. And even if they're really nice guys, and they're not at all trying to make you feel uncomfortable, if you don't see a lot of other women in the weight room, you just, you kind of have to steel yourself a little bit to, as Linda said, get in there. So I love this theme emerging, which is that it isn't just about more consumption, of knowledge. It is about active participation, and that your perspective, your voice on these issues matter. They matter a lot, and so I think that's huge. So as we wrap up, I want to, Linda, you've talked so much about money, about the economic empowerment of women, about how it's not just about, managing money, it's about investing money. I'd love for you to share a little bit more about, you've got a book coming out, 10 Things Everyone Should Know About Money. Where can we go to learn more about the work that you're doing on this topic of women and money?
So the book's coming out in June. You can find more details about it on my website, which is www.lindadavies.com. In the book, I cover all these topics and more. I also, on Instagram, Linda Davies Writer, I have posts. My publisher has posts called 10 Things Money. I do blogs. Sign up to my website and you'll get blogs on regular topics as things come into the money world, the money sphere and the economy that I think are relevant. So yeah, I think those, and Twitter, Linda Davies Auth, I'm on that too.
Got it. Excellent. And how about you, Katrine?
Well, I'd love for everyone to sign up to my newsletter, which is called The Wealth of Women, and it gives you a brief feminist take on economics and business every Thursday. And I mean, who doesn't need that?
Yeah, exactly.
It's free, and sign up on my website. It's katrinemarcal.com.
So katrinemarcal.com, Linda Davies, it's spelled Davies, pronounced Davis.com. And what I love about this is these are newsletters and posts about money, about economics, about wealth building, about investing that are written by women sort of through our lens, which doesn't mean necessarily they're going to sound any different. They might, but I think it's really important to be able to hear from women who are educating and writing and speaking about these things and have done for a long time. Thank you both for your time today. I so appreciate it. This is really just the beginning of a deeper conversation about this for so many. Linda, what's one takeaway, one sort of message, one takeaway that you'd like to leave with women about broader economic issues, about really taking our seat at that table?
I think invest in the stock market. Invest in your own domestic stock market. If you're in the UK, US, Canada, you don't need to do anything fancy. Get a well-diversified fund. Check out the history. There's a lot of due diligence. You can find out more about what to do in my book to do the due diligence. But make your money work for you while you are asleep. Make your money pull a night shift. Invest in the stock market, and then pretend you're on a desert island, sit back, wait for 5 or 10 years and let it do some heavy lifting. Let your money investments go into the weight room for you.
Amazing. How about you, Katrine?
Ooh, well, I guess that would be the economy is too important to leave to the economists. Right?
It sure is. All right. Linda Davis, Katrine Marcal, thank you so much for joining us today. I so appreciate it.